Good afternoon. My name is Luke Nwaya. I'm professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro Yatsek program for the study of Ukraine. It's now been nearly 10 months since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. I'm not sure many would have predicted it would still be going on 10 months later. And I'm also don't think most people predicted, certainly did not predict that Ukraine would have been so successful on the battlefield. So to discuss the sort of course of the war and where we are and the prospects of Ukrainian victory, we have three scholars with us. Professor Ivan Gomza, who's an associate professor at the Kyiv School of Economics and head of the public policy and governance. He's written on nationalism and authoritarianism, and he's now working on, quite relevant book on the consequences of war on society and politics. Next, we have Professor Maria Popova, who's Jean Monnet Chair at McGill in political science, and Professor Oksana Shevel, who's associate professor at Tufts. Both have written books on Ukraine that received the same Ukrainian Association Award, so they're twins in that sense, but they're also twins in another sense, that they're writing a book together on Russia and Ukraine, entangled histories and diverging states. I think I've gotten the title right. So anyways, so let me start off with you, Ivan. You're on the ground in Ukraine. So what's the situation like? You have electricity, so we're happy that that's the case. Can you describe the mood in Kyiv right now?
Well, thank you for having me. And actually, I think that the best words to describe the situation on the ground is no generalization. Do no generalization. You can have no generalizations. Let me give you an example. For instance, here at Kyiv School of Economics, we continue, teaching. We do it via Zoom online. And several weeks ago, I had a session with my students, and it was like I started my lecture with the words, guys, if I disappear, it's because of the power outages, because they're really, often, they come very often here in Kyiv, where I am. And then another lady, like a student, she said, come to Odessa, nothing happens here. We have electricity all the day around. Today, like two weeks after that discussion, I can say that in Odessa, there is no electricity. And on the other hand, in Kyiv, well, the situation is a little bit better. When I say a little bit better, I actually want you to understand that, for instance, this week, I have 4 hours of electricity, then 4 hours of no power. And the previous week, I actually had power only for 3 hours per day. And when you have the electricity for that ridiculously small amount of time, it's really difficult. I mean, if you listen to my voice carefully, you can hear that I'm sick, I'm ill. It is because in my apartment, the temperature is around 18 degrees Celsius. It's something like 65 Fahrenheit. So it's quite cold. I mean, especially when it is -10 on the outside. And when you have no electricity, it means that power heating is not working because the microprocessor there, they depend on electricity. In many cases, and in my personal case, you have no water because water pumps, they don't work and they cannot, mount the water to the second, third, or even 10th story. So multi-story buildings, they are without water when there is no electricity. So, I mean, there are 2 words to describe the situation on the ground. So no generalizations, because it might be okay, let's say in Kyiv, and it might be really terrible somewhere near Kharkiv. And the second, it is challenging. So, I mean, it is challenging. But on the other hand, the mood is up a bit because, I have just read the interviews, like a panel interviews by some OSINT journalists who are working both with the Russian and Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainian respondents, they were asked in July and just several days ago. So Ukrainian respondents, they are actually telling, we're going to win this war because, we know how to do it. We have the grand strategy. We have more and more material to do it, so we're going to do it. And the Russian counterpart in this panel, in July, they were more sure of their victory, and now they are in despair. They say that we have no grand strategy. Politics, they are actually interrupting with the war making, and so Russia is bound to lose. That is according to Russian officers' words. So, and I'm using those quotations to show you the mood here in Ukraine. I mean, it is challenging, as I told you. It is cold. It is very unpleasant. But actually, we know that we are going to do it.
So you must, I mean, how much of your day do you spend basically surviving? I mean, it's amazing you're doing this research right now. I mean, for those of us who don't have to worry about electricity or warm water, we can do research. But I mean, how much of your day would you say you spend just like getting by, like, taking a shower? Or,
let me give you an example, because the best word to describe that kind of experience is contracting. Because when you have electricity, you actually have to do everything at once. You have to go to take shower. You have to run to do buying. You have to run to shops, because without electricity, supermarkets, they are not working. And at the same time, you have to give your lectures and conduct research. And actually, sometimes it is empowering, because when you have only 3 hours to do everything that, you cannot procrastinate. So you must do it very quickly. And then when there is power outages, so you have no electricity, I just open my Kindle, get under the blanket, and I read or listen to audiobooks, and I kind of relax. But once again, the point I'm making is that this experience, it teaches us not to postpone. Memento mori. Do everything you can just now, because maybe tomorrow doesn't come, even if that tomorrow means the day with electricity, not in some more drastic situation when you might be bumped out of existence. But actually do everything you can just now, because in an hour you might have no electricity, and then 3 days of blackout.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. I mean, I just want to say that the Kyiv School of Economics is really a kind of a paradigm of sort of an institution which has really been incredibly adaptive and sort of, during the war, and managed to sort of undertake a number of educational programs despite sort of incredibly trying conditions. So I'll turn to you, Oksana and Maria. I mean, Oksana, I saw you posted on Twitter about, Ukrainian public opinion. I mean, looking at, Ivan's given us a sort of on the ground picture. Maybe you could sort of take it up, 60,000 feet, sort of what do you see in terms of the Ukrainian mood?
Yeah, sure. Can I actually share the screen, because I can show the same poll to the, would it let me? Yeah. So let me just show you. Yes, so this is one of the latest polls from the rating group that is asking, it's in Ukrainian, but I'll translate for the audience. The question was, in your opinion, up until what point Ukraine should be fighting? And the options were until all the territories are liberated, including Crimea and Donbass. And that was the largest option, not only majority of the population, and you can see on the side the breakdown by region and also by age. Now 85%, up from 74% in February, believe that Ukrainians should continue to fight until they liberate all of the territories, including Crimea and Donbass. And the second option was to fight until Russians are pushed back to the border, the pre-invasion February border, so essentially without Crimea and Eastern Donbass. And that option is supported by 9%, down from 16%. And there is also this curious 4% of the population that wants to continue fighting in Russia, even after Russians are kicked out of Ukraine. So that's sort of on the logic that, that Russia would, when I assume that it's the way people reason, that it would be a threat to Ukraine until, the regime in Russia is overthrown. So, but that's clearly a very, very small minority. So, I mean, to me, sort of what it shows, and this kind of reinforces some of the things that Ivan was saying, that even though the situation is incredibly tough for the people, the strategy that Putin had, to the extent we think he had it, was that it would basically break the resolve, break the will to fight, right? And then Ukrainians who are suffering from blackouts and from, all these very challenging, daily situation would start kind of supporting peace settlement essentially on any terms, just so they can get the electricity back, right? And would put pressure on the Ukrainian government. And we see that's not happening, right? That's not happening either regionally or by age group, or certainly not, nationwide. So I think that's important to keep in mind, when there are all these discussions we hear in the West that like, well, we should negotiate, right? Ukrainians should be made, to settle, right, with Putin somehow. So first of all, if you listen to the Ukrainians themselves, they're the ones who are suffering from the war, and you see these sets of attitudes, right? And again, if we sort of think about why people believe this, I think the extent of human rights abuses, right, and outright genocide that's going on the occupied territories, I think that's a big part why for Ukrainians, the settlement whereby some territories would be left for Russians to basically continue engaging in these practices is just not acceptable. I mean, the reports have been coming out, those of you who follow the news, you know how horrendous they are, but on sort of the increase in horrendousness in recent days are the reports about children being tortured. So the torture chambers for children that have been uncovered, reports of 7-year-olds gang raped. I mean, it's completely horrendous. So I think, that's really those, maybe in the audience or elsewhere in the world who believe that, any peace is sort of better. And like, as long as the fighting stops, like that's better than the bombs falling. That's not how many people feel, because, exactly the kind of methods of occupation and brutality of the occupation that the Russian regime is perpetuating. So I don't know, we can, continue this, but that's just something I wanted to highlight that particular.
Right, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the notion that that somehow, by leaving territory in Russian hands, that promotes peace. I mean, it's certainly not peace for for those living under Russian occupation. I mean, one of the interesting things about it's, it struck me about those numbers is that the total absence of regional variation. I mean, that is, that for those of us who studied Ukraine for many years, that's striking. I mean, there's whatever the question is, there's always been, especially when it relates to Russia, massive differences in opinion between East and West and the like. But that's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, if we sort of begin to get kind of fine-grained analysis, I mean, there are some polls that still show, some regional variation, but first of all, it's not as stark as it was before. And again, there would still be majority in these historically pro-Russian quote-unquote regions in the East and the South, essentially supporting the same agenda that the West and the center, maybe with somewhat smaller percentage, right? As opposed to supporting the alternative options.
Right.
Yeah.
Maria, do you want to comment in here?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, of course, the people in the East and South are disproportionately suffering. And you might think that as a result, they would support a peace settlement at higher numbers, regardless of their attitude to Russia. But I think the fact that there isn't so much variation actually speaks to the fact that occupation is not really seen as peace.
Ivan?
Yeah, I actually want to add some theoretical considerations on that. And that is about the terror bombing. I mean, the concept, the idea that you can use aviation, or in this case, cruise missiles and drones, actually to submit the population by terror to, some peace acceptance. And actually, as historical data shows, it never works. I mean, take Japan under the imperial regime, take the Nazi Germany, take the Vietnam, it never works. It actually makes the population only, more eager to fight till the bitter end to its adversary. So, I mean, the situation we are having here in Ukraine is just another illustration of that. The terror against civilian population, it never works. Actually, no, in terrorist studies, we have the so-called hock effect, when after terrorist attacks, civilian population actually demands the government to be more vigorous against the attackers. You have the same situation here during the full-blown war.
Right. Indeed, one wonders, what is going on in the heads of Russian policymakers, because, I think at some level they must be aware of this. And so, I mean, I don't know, do you guys have any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, we're just kind of...
Well, yeah, Oksana, please.
Oh, I'll just very quickly, because I actually happened to read, somebody posted it on Twitter, the article by Trenin, right, the former Carnegie, who's, I think, considered, I mean, he's kind of became a Putin shrill, but he's considered kind of one of the best of the strategic thinkers in Russia, right? And if you read this article, which I think was published in the Russian Global Affairs, it's basically, it's amazing because it's very kind of broad, like big eye view, kind of the whole global politics. And the thinking seems to be that, first of all, any kind of compromise on Ukraine for Russia is suicidal, right? Like basically the argument is that if Russia gives up any of its objectives in Ukraine, it loses sovereignty, and they define sovereignty as being this great power that can throw its weight around in the world. So Russia existing within its borders, kind of minding its own business, they consider it unacceptable, right? Which is quite telling in itself, right? So basically, he says, no matter the cost, they have to push and at least occupy central, western, and eastern Ukraine. Like, what are they smoking there? I don't know. But that's they sort of seeming to be willing to give up on Galicia and Volhynia, this whole sort of age-old construct that these are somehow like Austrian Genstab, wrong Ukrainians, and everybody else could be incorporated, which of course we know now that's not really, realistic, but at least it seems to be still the goal. And the second, it's kind of like a 3-point plan. And the 2 other points, he says, one, to continue and increase cooperation with what they call the global majority, which are basically developing world countries that have not joined sanctions against Russia, right? And they kind of saying that Russia should, continue to mine and increase that. And finally, the third point is they keep counting on the Western unity breaking, right? I'm sure we'll get to it later. But that sort of seems to be the grand plan, right? That they, first of all, are not willing to compromise anything, which I think is important to keep in mind, because many of these calls for settlement say, oh, Ukrainians are not willing to negotiate. Ukrainians should be pressured. Why pressure Ukrainians when Russians have not offered anything, right? Like they haven't offered to withdraw. They have, and the think training echoes that, right? And then this sort of plan that, one way or the other, with, that they can last long enough cooperating with the developing world, and then Western unity will break, and then they will get their way. That seems to be the strategy, if we listen to training.
Yeah, no, I think that's worth emphasizing. I mean, we just have not seen any serious indication on the Russian side that they're willing to make any kind of compromises to their fundamental goals that they had on February 23rd, 2022. And I mean, and so how can you even begin to talk about negotiation unless you see at least any kind of signal from Putin or the Russian side? It doesn't make any sense to me at all. So maybe let's turn then to the European response, which was mentioned by Oksana. I think just as sort of background, I think if we take us back to sort of late 2021, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, it's interesting because some argue, like Mearsheimer, that the Putin's invasion was caused by sort of fears of NATO aggression. I think the reality is quite the opposite. That the invasion happened because Putin perceived European weakness. He had tentacles in the German elite, and many political parties who sort of took a pro-Russian stance. So I'll start with you, Maria. So where do you see the state right now of European unity around Ukraine?
So I will also share the screen with a recent poll done by Eurobarometer, which shows, just a sec, let me find where it is. Sorry, I don't know why it's not appearing.
Well, maybe you could just describe the...
Yeah, no, I found it, sorry.
Okay.
There it is.
Okay.
So, so this shows that actually, contrary to Putin's expectations, the European Union member states have public opinion that is largely happy with the level of support that the EU has provided to Ukraine. You see that the average for all of Europe is 74%, and the bottom countries are also at about 50%, which is already high enough. And consider also that the way in which the question is worded, it just means, do you approve or disapprove of the current level of aid, which also means that people who think aid is not enough, who would like to support Ukraine even more, may be ending up in the dissatisfied group. So what this indicates is that Putin's, I'll end the sharing. What it indicates is that to a large extent, Putin's miscalculation of Europe's resolve has been significant. That he keeps expecting that Europe will fracture, but this is not happening. Obviously, his main bet for the fall and winter was that energy blackmail. will cause a shift in opinion in Europe. And what we're seeing, even though this is the beginning of the winter, we're seeing that a lot of the alarmist predictions from the summer about how much Europe is going to suffer and how quickly this will tank support for Ukraine are not materializing. We're seeing neither actually significant energy crisis anywhere in Europe. Europe managed to prepare quite well for this situation, but we're also not seeing the high politicization of this issue among the European electorate. What we see instead is that basically Putin has, as Thane Gustafsson, who is a specialist on energy politics, has put it, Putin has committed energy suicide. He has basically disrupted a half a century long solid relationship, which was the basis of cooperation between Europe and the Soviet Union. He has completely disrupted that. And the important thing here is that this, and that's why I think Gustafsson calls it a suicide, is that there's no returning from this. He has disrupted this relationship to the point that it would be impossible to build it back to this level, even if the war is over tomorrow, because trust is broken, and quite physically, the relationship is disrupted through the destruction of the pipeline. But the point here is that that in addition, what Europe will take away as a message from this current situation is that it can survive without Russian energy, and the longer it does without major disruptions, the more there will be no desire to return to it. So it's really been a humongous and important miscalculation by Putin.
No, it is remarkable. But just quickly, when was that poll taken?
It's very recent.
Very recent. Okay. I mean, it is quite stunning the degree of radical structural transformation you've seen in Europe. I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, according to EU statistics, at the beginning of this year, so just very recently, Europe as a whole relied on Russian gas for about 50% of its supplies, and now it's down to 18%. I mean, I'm not sure historically whether we've seen anything equivalent in terms of the rapidity of this sort of fundamental structural transformation, which, as you said, this was a policy began, in the 1970s under Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik. I mean, this is a very long-term policy that, a source of Russian influence that, like in Ukraine before, it's very similar. It seems like Putin has this habit of taking assets that it has, or the sources of influence, and basically chopping off his arm. Anyways, but it is quite remarkable. So, Oksana, I want to talk to you about sort of another source of, I'm sure, which is sort of hope on Putin's end, that sort of these wave of Ukrainian migrants into Europe would sort of foster kind of right-wing populism. I mean, what do you see about the sort of reaction to Ukrainian migrants in Europe, which are quite a large number?
Yeah. I mean, there is actually interesting research that's been done, in particular by my colleague at Tufts, on which is called weaponized migration, which basically, the regimes, various types of authoritarian regimes would use sometimes, migration flows as a way to put pressure, right, and achieve foreign policy aims. I think it is still kind of debatable to what extent Putin is actually maybe, he wants to use it like this. I mean, clearly he invaded not in order to create migrant flows to Europe, but that was probably one of the sort of, from his calculus, a positive externality that exactly if you're saying, if say Europeans get tired, not only from not having, enough energy or having to pay more for energy, but also all of these Ukrainians draining resources and so forth, right? Like that could strengthen the far right and therefore help his objectives. I mean, I think so far, broadly speaking, I don't think we see that happening, right? Like, I don't think there is some kind of backlash against, Ukrainian refugees. There is still a lot of compassion, the poll that Maria showed support. I mean, that said, I think if you look at sort of more specifically, I mean, there are certainly instances of, we had a shelter for Ukrainian refugees, I think burned in Germany somewhere, right? Like, I mean, there are these, anecdotal kind of evidence of people being asked, either to move or, that they are no longer getting the support, financial support that they need. And sometimes countries, I read a story, again, this is not my primary research at the moment, but I read an article about Poland, where, say, various problems in social policy that have been quite long-standing, right, are now some political actors blame it on Ukraine. So instead of, so yes, there are problems with, say, various social support for the native population, which predated, Ukrainian refugee crisis. But now, again, some political actors are trying to capitalize on it. So I think one thing important to keep in mind that at least to the extent we have opinion polls from Ukrainians who left Ukraine, most of them actually want to return. So this kind of situation that, is this going to be a longer term burden on Europe? It's connected to what happens with this war. So I think, again, the more weapons Ukraine gets, the faster this war can be brought to an end. The sooner, not everybody, but majority of these refugees clearly want to return, right? So that's something that's, I think it's important to keep in mind. And another thing I mentioned, again, it may be not specifically related to Ukraine, but to kind of migration challenge in Europe more broadly. I think there will be interesting studies done down the road about different response, say, to refugees from Ukraine crisis as opposed to, say, Syria crisis, right? And I think that goes to some of the maybe closets, quote unquote, darker closets of European society, right? The racism and all of these things, right? So I think there are many layers to looking at this migration. But broadly speaking, I think just like with energy situation, that if Putin had the calculus that these waves of Ukrainian refugees are going to break Western unity, I don't think we see that happening.
So the other dynamic, which I've heard sometimes talked about, is the gender dynamic of the migration. That the fact that there aren't as many young men, so standing in sort of, street corners. I think the response, that one explanation was that it kind of feeds into some Eastern European patriarchal cultures, and they're helping out these women and children. Do you think that's a factor? At all? Or?
I think, yeah, that's probably probably plays more than just one role, because it's also, for example, makes migrants more vulnerable, right? Because we are talking about women and children who were able to, who flee, because men under a certain age cannot leave Ukraine, right? There have been reports, again, not something I can speak with in a lot of detail, but say like anything from human trafficking to various forms of, abuse against these more vulnerable groups. I think that's obviously important, but you're right, it may, as far as kind of compassion for the refugees, if we are not talking about, young men of employable age who are predominant group, right, but more vulnerable populations, that actually may help. Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, Ivan?
I'll just add
there is also,
sorry.
Maria?
Maria.
I'll just add here that indeed it doesn't seem that the refugee issue can be politicized effectively within Europe. Just from watching some of the debates in Bulgaria, which is the country with the lowest support for Ukraine in the EU, and a country that received proportionally a lot of refugees. The way that the anti-Ukrainian narrative is structured is not structured around refugees at all. The complaints are, why are we considering sending military aid? Why are we considering sending other aid when we are the poorest EU member? But the refugee issue has not been politicized within that. And I think that shows the limitation of that issue as a wedge.
Yeah, Ivan.
And there is another important issue regarding the refugees, because recently I had read some statistics, and once again, I cannot, guarantee, vouch that it is true. But according to that statistics, the refugees in Poland actually paid in taxes due to their occupational activities more than they consumed, in social help. So actually, refugees is not always about problems, and I think that also plays to that quite positive attitude we are observing. Once again, I don't mean that it is the main reason, but as always in social science, it adds on the vulnerability that Oksana mentioned, but also their, let's say, the situation that they also participate in the life and economies of the host countries.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Ivan. I think, it probably doesn't hurt that this happens at a time of incredible labor shortage in Europe, and as a result of COVID. So it's just interesting, all this stuff, in some ways. As we know in Canada, we desperately want more immigrants because our economy relies on it. So I wonder if that helped on the sense. But overall, I mean, I'm getting this, bizarrely optimistic sense that there, this kind of Ukraine fatigue, which you would have thought, like, I remember thinking, I'm sure you were too, in January and February, there was this shock in Europe after the invasion, and then the shock around Bucha. And then I sort of, the analytical part of me said, well, this is not going to last. There's going to be, it's going to be normalized. There's going to be Ukraine fatigue. But, weirdly, a couple of things. One, Ukraine is still on the front pages of newspapers, at least, the New York Times that I receive every morning. I don't know about the other newspapers. So it's still front in attention, hasn't been relegated to page 6, as you might have expected. It oftentimes happens in other conflicts in Afghanistan. And, what we've just seen, there hasn't been the sort of, at least the degree of backlash that we might have expected. So you're the experts, tell me why haven't we seen this? Anybody want to jump in first? Maria.
I can try. Actually, my opinion is actually, the war in Ukraine, or as I prefer to call it, the Russo-Ukrainian war, it is not a situation when just two countries, they try to settle their differences. It actually resonates to their Western opinions on themselves. I mean, if a nascent democratic country is being mauled and destroyed by a dictatorship just somewhere here in Europe, it tells something about the values Europe is built upon. And that is why, because of that resonance, it cannot fade away. If it fades, somehow the soul will die.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, I would echo Ivan's point here. I think Ukraine has managed very effectively to communicate a narrative about the war that links Ukraine's war of resistance to European values. So at this point, I think within Europe, this has been internalized as a message that Ukraine is fighting for us as well. And that's what maintains the momentum, and that's what makes it different from other wars that are seen simply as a humanitarian project to aid another. This has become a war where you're helping yourself, you're helping European security writ large, and I think that's what counts for the fact that support is sustained, and probably even increasing in terms of the range of things that European governments may not have considered back in February, but are now on the table. Things like reparations and a tribunal and fighting to victory. All of this has developed over the course of the war.
Yeah, I second all of this. I will just sort of throw in one potential additional factor that helps to sustain the attention. And talking about is, Lucan, you said yourself that Russia is sort of cutting the branch it is sitting on in many ways. And I think the atrocities that they're committing are helping that further, right? Because it's one thing that you have this narrative that, like, well, Ukraine maybe had some like far-right Nazis, or like, okay, like who really knows, right? And then, they oppress Russian speakers, and here comes, the Russian army saving the day. But then once, the Russian army is doing the things that the army is doing, kind of horrifying all of the civilized world over and over and over again, right? I think that's additional factor. I mean, that by itself probably wouldn't be enough, because there are plenty of conflicts where terrible atrocities are committed. But if they are, somewhere far away from Europe, or don't kind of, as Maria said, sort of seen as like other are being affected, right? So I think these things that Ivan and Maria mentioned are very important. But I think, again, kind of ironically, Russia is helping the case of, having the attention on.
Right. And I would sort of add that, the remarkable, this is another sort of prediction of mine that, that hasn't come to fruition, the remarkable self-restraint on the Ukrainian side. I mean, the treatment of prisoners of war. We saw, there was an interview that was inadvertently posted on Russian state media with a former Russian prisoner of war in Ukraine, and they were trying to get the dirt, and he basically responded, well, we had 3 meals. I think the worst thing he said was that they made him sing pro-Ukrainian songs. And I think at some point he said he was better than
if he
right.
misbehaves.
And so, like, if the worst thing that happens to Russian POWs that they're forced to sing pro-Ukrainian songs, I mean, that, I don't know what the Geneva Conventions say on that, but that's pretty good. And also just amazing from the point of view of, I mean, it would be, perfectly understandable, if not right, for Ukrainians a sense of revenge against, I just haven't seen, we have, the country is covered with Western journalists. I mean, where are the stories of these sort of revenge acts against Russian soldiers? It is quite remarkable.
Those stories are in Russian media. I mean,
well, yeah.
I monitored Russian Telegram channels for an article, and there are plenty of stories about atrocities committed by Ukrainians against the Russian POWs. But they are, they have no solid data to support those claims. So
right.
There are some anecdotal evidence and hearsay, nothing more.
Yeah, but it's just amazing because, given the in contrast to wars in Syria, there's just a lot of journalists in Ukraine. So, there's a lot of information being collected. So one assumes that these atrocities just aren't happening. Okay, I wanted to next talk about sort of, we had talked about changes in Europe and how support has remained steady. I mean, what are your guys' opinion about the U.S. Congress? We're about to sort of have a sort of uncertain situation in which the Republicans now will control the House. And certainly big parts of the Republican Party are very isolationist. We have Tucker Carlson, who's regularly featured on Russian propaganda as opposed to Zelensky in the war. So any of you guys want to come in and sort of what happens with U.S. support, which has been so critical?
Well, I can start just with a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think the fact that, if you want to say very broadly that, yes, it would be better if the Republicans did not control the House, right? But at the same time, the Republican Party is not uniformly on that position, right? So there is a division within the Republican Party. That the fact that the pro-Trumpian wing did not do it as well as it hoped in the midterm elections, I think is important. So I think, it may become sort of like an obstacle to overcome as opposed to a kind of the stop of the aid. So I don't expect personally that there would be, stop. And even like if we're talking about sort of what the obstacle might consist of, it might not even consist of directly kind of let's not give Ukraine this aid. It's more that the House can basically drain the attention of the administration. They can start some investigation of, Biden for something rather. And that just drains the attention of the, American political class from, Ukraine, from foreign aid, focusing on whatever was on Hunter Biden's laptop or you name it. So I think, so these sorts of kind of obstacles we can expect. But I don't think, again, given the divisions within the Republican Party, given the fact that this fringe of the party did not do so well, and kind of given the history of the Republican Party that traditionally has been more hawkish against Russia, right, than the Democrats. So I don't think that would be a detrimental sort of set of developments in U.S. domestic politics for Ukraine.
What do you think? Anybody else? Maria?
Yeah, I agree with Oksana's take. It seems that the anti-Ukrainian portion of the U.S. electorate is sort of on the extremes of the two parties. So it is difficult for them to cooperate and coordinate how to stop aid. I think in that way, this is whatever the sort of the polls show that may be in opposition to helping Ukraine, it's worth considering that they're probably highly divided within that group, which would make them less efficient in stopping aid.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You point to something that I've talked about is sort of this kind of red-brown coalition in support of Putin. On the one side, you have the far right, which likes Putin's authoritarianism, likes his opposition to radical social change, LGBTQ rights on the other hand, and then on the far left, you have this sort of deep anti-Americanism, this deep anti-militarism of the Chomsky and crew that sort of, is also sort of likes Putin's anti-Americanism. I mean, I have to say, as I've said before, my Pakistani in-laws, many of whom were at least initially sort of very Putin curious because their hatred of America is so high, and I'm sure this is the case in obviously in Latin America and in Africa as well, that they sort of this kind of negative alliance with Putin. But on the other hand, you're right to point out, Maria, that it also divides this coalition and makes it harder for them to sort of mount a united front. Okay, so next I want to sort of talk about actually sort of internal politics in Ukraine. I mean, all we've heard about is, rightly so, is we've had several sessions on this sort of Zelensky's amazing leadership. And sort of, I'm wondering, Ivan, sort of, is there an opposition in Ukraine? It's been 10 months. Are there complaints? I mean, what is, I remember looking at Kyiv Independent, and they have a subsection of on internal politics in Ukraine. And for a long time, it was only stories from like December of 2021. It was like almost like Ukrainian internal politics have stopped. So what's your sense?
Well, actually, we are all aware of the rally around the flag effect, and it definitely had its impact on the Ukrainian population. So somehow it did freeze the, the internal dynamics of politics. But on the other hand, I said freeze, I didn't say killed, because to give you just one example, yesterday there was a huge uproar in some circles of the Ukrainian civil society because of a new bill which actually takes the participation of local communities in the land allocation process. And due to the results, it is sad. Once again, it's like, it's not 100%, but it is sad that maybe local communities will lose their control on the lands they are sitting on, and the huge magnates will come and build everything, ugly buildings they want to build. So, and people actually were galvanized against that bill, which shows that war or no war, other instances and other political issues, they tend to rise. And it will happen more and more. To give you just another example, 2 days ago, there was a kind of a happy day in the community which observes the court system of Ukraine. Maria, I'm bowing to you because the OASK, Administrativny Okruzhny Sud Mista Kyива, it's like a notoriously corrupt court. It has been disbanded, finally. And why I'm saying finally, because actually there was a bill to do it, which was, marooned for 2 years by Zelensky, but then due to the pushes by Western governments, it was actually, terminated. I mean, the OASK. And I'm referring to it because, OASK is dead, but also there are some problems with the special anti-corruption prosecutor and other issues, and civil society is fighting to push it forward. So politics, internal politics is not dead. Most of Ukrainians, they say, well, yes, Zelensky he surprised us, but there are many who say, but still, he's not my guy. And others who say, and for sure, I don't want him to, occupy, the office for the third term, not the second one, which is constitutionally permitted, but for the third term. So people, they don't want the dictator, the victorious or glorious Zelensky. So internal politics are still there.
That's encouraging. So you're kind of, at this point, I'm gonna hold you to this. You're predicting a kind of Churchill outcome.
Exactly. Actually, I use the Churchill syndrome very often. I mean, you can also think about George H.W. Bush syndrome, who won the war and lost the office. And it happens all the time. I mean, actually, the book you mentioned, I'm going to write. It's also about how politicians who won the war lost the office. So it might happen to Zelensky as well. And maybe it is for good.
That's encouraging. Because no, it's interesting because I think what's remarkable about this is that the absence of opposition oftentimes really hurts governance. I mean, I was talking to some friends of mine in the Canadian government. They make decisions with the expectation that how the opposition will respond. So it's basically it helps them to sort of avoid doing stupid things. And so one worries about a situation in which for so long there's no opposition, but I'm assuming or no sort of kind of organized opposition. But I'm assuming the war also provides a kind of a motivation, obviously for governance. Do you have any thoughts, Maria?
If I could just jump in on
Yeah.
this, I mean, I agree with what Ivan said. I think it is very much kind of a moving set of developments, right? And I would probably say that it's a little bit maybe too early to draw conclusions, right, as to how it would play out. Because civil society, I mean, there are some things we know for a fact, and some things I think are a bit of a question mark, right? I think the civil society as this very robust kind of pro-democracy source is there. It's probably stronger than it was before, and we can expect it to kind of remain, this group or network, or whatever you want to call it, that would keep pressure on the government, even if, say, there is like no opposition party as such, right? Now, how effective they would be, I think that's a bit of a kind of maybe more of a question mark, because now, for example, with the martial law, you cannot have public demonstrations, right? So if before, we had many kind of mini Maidans, right? The government would pass some, law that, or plan to pass that society didn't like, and there would be like organized gatherings and so forth. Like you can't do this now. So yes, you can do petitions and all of these things. Would they be as effective? I don't know. Like I read just yesterday, I think the media law was passed that many of the media organizations, journalist groups are questioning. The government is saying it is passed it because it's required for the EU integration, but the media activists are saying that they kind of misinterpreting what the EU requires, and there is already, I think, some petition for the president not to sign it, right? So Ivan is absolutely right that there is very much domestic politics happening, right? But yet, like if, say, the president really wanted to pass certain legislation, even if society is against it, could he get away with it? And I would say, like now, at least with the martial law, it's certainly easier than before, right? In part because, you have kind of say that you need it for the war effort. There is no possibility to publicly organize against it. Would that continue after the martial law ended? I don't think so. I mean, Ukrainians have a long history of not just kind of deferring to the government, and all attempts to establish some kind of form of dictatorship or authoritarianism didn't go so well. So I don't think Zelensky would become, new Yanukovych. But I think this is something that, we all should keep watching, and because there are some things that are kind of, going for democracy, and some things that potentially present an obstacle.
Definitely. So democracy should never be considered a given. Maria, can you just talk a little bit, what motivated the elimination of the court?
The elimination of the court is a long-standing demand by civil society judicial reform proponents, because that court was kind of the focus of the seat, if you will, of corrupt networks within the judiciary, which were stalling judicial reform throughout the post-Maidan period. And it's a feature of post-communist judicial politics, not just in Ukraine, all over Eastern Europe, when the judiciary was basically stalling attempts to make it independent from politicians and accountable at the same time. And oftentimes this pushback came from entrenched judicial elites. So you have to break that somehow in order to unleash judicial reform in a rule of law direction. So this was a good step taken. The reason usually politicians were stalling that, were not really going after these corrupt judicial networks, is because they could be useful, right? So it's a coalition between even reformist politicians who may think, well, yes, we want to reform, but at the same time, these people could be useful when push comes to shove. So this was a major step. But I wanted to add on the opposition. Is there opposition in Ukraine still? Another development from today in surrounding judicial reform, where judicial reform activists are complaining about an opinion by the Venice Commission given on the new constitutional court reform. And the complaint there is that the Venice Commission potentially agreed to water down the reforms as a nod to the government. So the civil society activists are criticizing that and saying, no, let's stick to our guns. Let's make sure that constitutional court reform as we envision it goes ahead. So I think what we're going to see, given that Ukraine is now on the path to EU membership, what we're going to see is this constant negotiation between not just the government and parties and civil society, but the EU will be a major player in this. And we've seen, again, this is something repeated from the EU accession process of all the Eastern European members, where civil society activists pushing reform, instead of going to the streets and trying to protest, were actually appealing to the EU to pressure the government to change their position on important topics. So the EU and civil society are going to be partners in this process, and this can be a powerful opposition, if you will, a powerful constraint on government.
Okay, great, thanks. I think that's certainly also very important in terms of maintaining Ukrainian democracy is, you know, the sort of accountability, and dependence on the West. So I want to end here with a kind of discussion of kind of why everybody got the invasion so wrong, right? I mean, you look at, you know, in February, you know, I think it was, you know, there are exceptions, but I think, I mean, you know, almost everyone, you know, assumed that, you know, Ukraine would be defeated on the battlefield. I mean, I was more optimistic than others, but I also thought that, you know, I envision Ukrainian resistance being much more in the form of guerrilla resistance rather than sort of victories on set piece battles. You know, this is, anybody want to weigh in sort of, you know, why did people get it so wrong? And I guess the second question is, you know, just because, you know, we got it wrong, and, you know, and thankfully, you know, Ukraine has been victorious on the battlefield, doesn't mean it, you know, such an outcome was, you know, inevitable or even the most likely outcome. And so what do you guys think? So who wants to come in first? Ivan, yeah.
If I may, I mean, ladies, I'm sorry if I'm just occupying the microphone.
Go.
Thank you. Well, my explanation, it will dwell on the battlefield effectiveness. And I mean, when you have a war, it depends on battles and on the strategy. And I'll focus only on the battles. Russian battlefield effectiveness is really poor. People actually overestimated it. They took for, you know, for the face value, the proclamations by Putin that he was modernizing the army, that he was modernizing the military, that he was building all those Wunderwaffe, which actually did not exist. So they did not take into account the nature of the Putin's regime. And actually, for us political scientists, it comes not as a surprise. I mean, we know that kleptocratic regimes, so that patrocracies, they are corrupt to the bones, which is surprising that people didn't use the wealth of information on the corruption in the neo-patrimonial regimes and the way how they fight. I mean, we know in political science that neo-patrimonial regimes, they are poor fighters. They start wars and often lose them. And so, and we didn't connect that theoretical information with the practical empirical data on Russia. So many people didn't understand that. And I also, with the privilege of the hindsight, we actually say, you know, it's only natural that they are fighting so poorly. And that was the part of the explanation that people, observers, they overestimate Russia, they underestimated the Ukrainian army. And here's that l'effet de la surprise, the surprise effect, that now everybody is watching. Wow, how is it possible? Actually, that's how.
Maria, Oksana, do you want to comment, jump in?
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Maria.
I would emphasize that, of course, prediction is very hard and things are contingent. But to some extent, what happened in this case was that we emphasized the positions of sort of international relations experts who don't look at the domestic capabilities and assets as much. And that was an easy prediction for them, given the size differential between Russia and Ukraine. We emphasized expertise on Russia, which tended to overestimate Russian capabilities, and also tended to more predict that there would be no war because it's not really understandable why Putin would need this war. And we ended up underestimating and emphasizing the positions that were coming on the basis of knowledge of Ukraine, which, if they didn't predict Ukrainian victory, predicted a much tougher confrontation between Russia and Ukraine.
Oksana, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just, like, I kind of, Maria stole my point. I was going to say that I think this broader sort of disbalance in the study of Ukraine and Russia, you know, this underlying assumption that Russia is in many ways better, like stronger, right? Like, you know, that there is sort of no comparison, right? And again, that the IR people are not really looking at the domestic situation. I think that's very true. This report, Lucan, that you sent in the, you know, in the comment from the this Royal Institute of International Studies, this UK think tank, I think it's very informative. It is also, like, I think it strikes the right note of caution to not get kind of too cavalier that Russian army is no good, right? They still have a lot of capacity and so forth, you know, including the military, like the artillery advantage and all of these things. But I think what is, to me, like when I read this, like what kind of was encouraging, you know, as somebody who wants Ukraine to win, that some of the problems they identify with the Russian army is not something that can be quickly fixed, right? Like this sort of cultural thing, this hierarchy, when the lower level commanders must follow orders from above, that they have very little autonomy, this sort of culture of false reporting, right? And I think that all goes to show, like, does Russia really have a path to victory, right? We know that it doesn't have a path to kind of control Ukraine at large that they want. I mean, I think that should be pretty clear for now. Can they prevail militarily? And that actually goes to Volodya Dubovic's point in the question that we didn't get to, you know, to look at. Like, what if Ukraine cannot win? Like, how do we make even this decision, right? I think that's an important question. But at what point, kind of militarily speaking, we could say, like, okay, this side can win and this side cannot win, right? Like, it has been now, you know, even been to 9 months. Ukraine had a few successful counteroffensives, but still Russia controls a big chunk of territory, right? Like, what do we say? Like, we need to give it 2 more months, 3 more months? Like, at what point we can say, right, it can't win? But I think, again, broadly speaking, it seems like, at least for the moment, consensus seems to be that, you know, the kind of problems that Russia has are not the kind of problems that can be fixed quickly, if at all. Ukraine definitely needs more heavy weapons from the West, that the West has been very reluctant to give, although, like, it's sort of slowly inching in that direction. We're now talking about Patriots and so forth. So probably we will have more clarity on the battlefield situation in the next, you know, over the winter months, right, to see what happens during the winter.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Daria, I don't know if you can post the link on the so everybody can see it. It's a really sort of very informative report, you know, by the Royal Institute. But a couple of things that come out that are interesting to me. One is, I think, well, you're right, Oksana, that sort of there are always these sort of, you know, more deep-rooted sort of sources of Russian failure. They note that there were sort of clearly not inevitable, you know, tactical failures very early on, that if Russia had sort of not assumed the most optimistic scenarios that they could take over Ukraine in 10 days, that, you know, the outcome, as they argue, might have been very different. And that, you know, just because popular opinion is on the side of the Ukrainian nation does not mean that Russia, you know, couldn't in principle win military victory.
But I think isn't it connected? Because the reason Russia assumed that it can win in 10 days is because they have certain delusions about Ukraine. And that's why they invaded to begin with. If they didn't assume this and didn't have these delusions, they may not have invaded at all, right? Because maybe they would have seen the hopelessness of it. So I think once we start sort of changing these underlying assumptions, like, it's kind of the whole picture needs to shift, right?
Right. Okay. Does anybody want to sort of, we're going to have to end it there. This has been a much more optimistic panel than, you know, one might think after 10 months of Russian invasion. But Yvonne or Maria, do you want to say anything? Do you have any last words of wisdom, or should we just end?
Ukraine will win.
Ukraine.
We will prevail.
Will prevail. Okay, thank you again. This was a wonderful conversation. This is our last event until Christmas. We're going to be having Luke Harding will be presenting his new book in January as part of this series. I'm very excited to talk with him. So, Merry Christmas and or whatever thing you celebrate in the holidays. So, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Right.
Right, thanks.